Welcome to CSC230. I'm just going to do a little overview of HTML and a little bit of CSS, just because when I was going over the quizzes, some people struggled with some areas, and I just want to make sure that I review some things with the code, since we've been working on code pretty hands-on, but we haven't talked a whole lot about theory yet. I've given you resources like W3 Schools, but I don't know how much you check it out, but I just want to go over some things with the code just to help you a little bit. Now, in Replit, this is our main repel, and remember, it's CSC230 W1. We named it. That's kind of like your main website. So this index page is our home page in our main directory. I often call it the root. So this is our root to all our other directories that we have in here. You could have multiple pages, but we have directories so that we can kind of contain things in a folder. But on our main page, all we really have is just links to other pages. You could kind of see them over here. And we have a link to our EX1 folder, our EX4 folder when you start working on that, and it will default to the index page inside there. So when you link to the EX1 folder, it knows to find index. If it doesn't find index, it will give you a 404. It won't find anything unless you actually put slash something HTML. If you had a page called directions.html, you'd have to put ex1 / directions.html. But we're just pointing it to our default index page in those directories. So that's how this is working. Now on our homepage, I just want to point out we have our doc type declaration, which just tells our browser to use HTML5. That's all it really does. It's not an HTML element. This is our HTML element, which encloses all our content of the page, whether it's visual content, and the visual content is in the body, or if it's other content like in the head tag, which is our character set, which says you can use all these characters and symbols available throughout the world. There's the viewport, which is for responsive design, which we won't worry about yet. Our title, which is in here, which basically shows up in a tab, and it's also part of searching on a search engine. This will come up. Sometimes people will put descriptions in the page as well, although that's not needed quite as much. But also for bookmarks, if it's in favorites, that title will show up. So you don't just want to put like, hello, welcome to my page. That's why we're putting things that are kind of more relevant to what we're doing. So this is all the kind of invisible stuff other than the title on a tab in our head tag. And we'll also put links to CSS in here when we start working with CSS, and I'll show that in a second. Our body tag is all the visual stuff. We have a main headline, H1. They go from H1 to H6, H1 being the largest or the most important. We have paragraphs in here. Can be one line, they could be multiple lines, but in a paragraph, everything is pretty much specified as opposed to a span. We'll talk about spans, which is if you just wanted to make one word in here bold or something, that would be a span. You would use a span for that, but everything else is pretty much block elements. A paragraph is a block element. You typically can't align a paragraph next to another paragraph unless you do something else because they're block elements. Usually they take up a whole block on a page. So that's why when you make a new paragraph, it becomes a block below it. It doesn't go aside of it. You don't see paragraphs aside of each other. That would be inline when you can do that. But anyway, let me look at our index page in EX1 that we worked on, and couple other things we have here. Again, we have our HTML element. It has language equals English. It's just, again, telling the browser to look for that. We still have our char set. Here we have our link to our style sheet, which is basically linking to this file. So that usually takes place in our head tag. You can also put styles in your head tag, but we're not doing that. Here we have a header, which basically is a kind of organizational element. We'll use organizational elements like header, section, footer, aside, figure, things like that we'll use. Now, I just want to indicate too that the header is an element and these things are the tags. So we have an opening header tag and a closing header tag, and a closing tag usually has the / in front of it. So when we talk about our tags, this is the tag, but the whole thing is an element. So opening tag, closing tag, but it's an H1 element. Same thing with paragraph. Opening, closing. Now, they don't all have opening and closing. If you look at an image just has its image element, it has the source attribute, and it has this value, which is actually the file. Sometimes this will be a full URL. If it's something that you found online, you would have a whole long URL here because you're getting the image from a web page. But since we have the image in our directory, we're just pointing to it relative to where we're at. That's why we can just put the name in there because it's in the same folder. If it was in a different folder, if it was in like a EX3 folder, you'd have to put EX3 and put a slash there to tell it, hey, go to the ex3 folder. But it's not. It's in the same folder, so you don't need any slashes in there. And alt tag just means it's alternate text in case the image doesn't load, or for text-to-speech software. Down here, again, figure is a organizational type of element. Same thing with fig caption. It's indicating that it's inside a figure and it's going to be a caption in a figure. H2 is just another headline, a little bit smaller. It should be. I had some issues where the headline was, I don't know, the same size when I was working on it. We have Unordered List, which is a bullet list with list items in there. Sometimes I call them line items because they're LIs, list item, line item, same thing. Ordered List, which actually will have numbers, and they work the same way. They have list items or line items in there, however you want to use them. But always be sure that we indent things so you can see what's inside of the other, so you can see what's the parent and what's the child. I mean, on our page here, HTML is the parent of everything pretty much. And then body is a child of HTML, even though we don't have it indented that way. Everything here, everything indent is children of that. So image is a child of the header element, which is a child of the body element. And that's kind of the way that works. That's the way we'll target things with CSS. So everything should kind of close. That's why when you click on one opening element, you should see the other element kind of highlight to tell you what's the closing tag. I should say tag. Figure element, opening tag, closing tag. Source is an attribute. These are the values, and we'll always use equals and quotes in HTML. Same thing here. Here's the href, the hyperlink reference. There's the attribute. There's the value. And again, you can have multiple values. We have one called target equals blank, and you have to make sure you close up the one value, put a space, and then start the target equals blank. You could keep putting multiple attributes in there. You just have to put a space in between them. Now, I think that's it. I think that's hopefully a good overview of HTML and CSS. Just a couple things to point out with CSS. This is a comment up here. This is a wildcard, this asterisk, which means pretty much anything. Change the margin to 0 and the padding to 0, and we're targeting our different elements. I like to start with kind of the more of the parents and work down to the children and keep them organized just so it's easy to find things in here. The way a declaration works, a CSS declaration, you have the selector, which could be an element, and here it is, it's body, and you have opening, closing curly braces. Every declaration in here should have a semicolon, and the way these work is they have a property and a value. Instead of an attribute and a value, they have a property. A property is with, and they use a colon. And when I hover over here, those things keep popping up. But they have a property of width, and then a colon, and then you put the value. And notice there's no space between px when you use those values. So if you're using px or m or anything, there's no space between them. And then you have to finish every one off with a semicolon, because if you don't, it doesn't read the next one correctly. Sometimes that might work, the width might work, but then something after it may not. So always check that you have your semicolons, you have your closing curly braces. Now, some things have commas. When we use RGB, there's commas in there. When we use fonts, we have commas. And when we use borders, sometimes we don't. So that's just something to get used to. Here's a border, and we just use solid space, and we use the color, and then we use the thickness. We use the style, either dotted line or something, or solid. We use the color, and then we use the thickness. And that does not have commas, but some things do have commas, like fonts. And also keep in mind, if you ever use a font for font family that has spaces, you have to use quotes around it. If they don't, even if it has a dash, you don't need a quote around it. But names that have spaces need quotes around them, or they'll have an issue with that particular font. The only other thing with CSS I just want to point out that we worked on is this thing trouble, top, right, bottom, left. So if you're specifying padding and there are different padding values, instead of doing padding top, padding left, padding right, and listing 4 different padding properties there, what you can do is just say padding and then list all 4 right in a row. So if some don't have any, you could just put 0. So this is doing 12 at the top, 0 at the right, 12 at the bottom, and 24 on the left. And basically it goes in that order, trouble. So hopefully you could kind of remember that. So that hopefully is a little introduction and covers some things maybe in the quiz when you face some of those things. And again, I'm just doing this very casually. We'll go over stuff in a little more detail and look at W3 schools as we get into things. We haven't done things, I think, with multiple. Oh, one other thing I just want to point out. When you put a comma between 2 things, this basically means the paragraph and the list item inside of section. So when you put a space, that means inside. But when you put a comma, that means also multiple ones. So this means image inside of figure. This means the P and the LI inside of section. So space means inside of or a child of, meaning it's somewhere inside there, somewhere an indented element. And then a comma means just multiple ones. So if you ever want to target multiple elements, I think we did that with the OL down here. We targeted both the UL and the OL, the unordered list and the ordered list, and we said give them both those properties. It just saves time. Instead of doing one for UL and then repeating it for OL, they can go together. So hopefully that helps a little bit. As far as some of the things we've been going over, we'll go over more as we go, but I want to make sure in the beginning we've done a lot of hands-on and we haven't talked a lot or lectured a lot. Not that I want to do that, but I did want to go over some things that we have been working on in case I didn't address them in the video, just in kind of one place, just to go over some things. So if you have any questions, any issues like that, you could put them in the discussion. Sometimes I ask, is there anything that's confusing to you or anything that I skipped over or did too quick? So let me know about that in the discussion.